Hello everyone and welcome to the MS-DOS project. Today I'll be following up a review I did several months ago, as well as covering a sequel in System Shock 2. System Shock was an extremely groundbreaking and innovative title, and was critically acclaimed across the board. Despite how exceptional the game was, however, unfortunately it was released in the middle of the Doom craze, with Doom 2 releasing less than a month after it. It was also a much less accessible title than Doom, being less of a fast-paced shooter and more of a plotting adventure and puzzle title with shooting elements and less straightforward controls. The game did sell well enough to keep Looking Glass Studios around, which seemed to be a pattern with them going forward. Soon after System Shock was released, Looking Glass began to finalize plans to help them more than just scrape by, but to actually succeed. Instead of developing games for a publisher and relying on royalty money to be able to continue to make games, they wanted to try out self-publishing. In this vein, their next game, Flight Unlimited, was self-published and became a massive critical success, selling over 300,000 copies over the next 2 years, and successfully competed with Microsoft's ever-popular Flight Simulator series. Around this time, Looking Glass signed a partnership deal with Viacom Media to produce several games, including a Star Trek Voyager adventure, as a way to make some funds going forward. Unfortunately, a year and a half later, Viacom decided to back out of the partnership entirely, leaving Looking Glass high and dry, having lost lots of time and money producing a game that would never come to market. Additionally, self-publishing was unable to bail them out, as their next two titles were both commercial failures and left the company crawling back to publishers to help keep them afloat. In the aftermath of this continuing disaster, 3 developers from Looking Glass, Ken Levine, Rob Fermier, and Jonathan Che, set out to start their own studio, Irrational Games. In an odd twist of fate, they very quickly ended up being signed on with Looking Glass, being contracted at first to make a sci-fi prototype in the still under development Thief engine. Despite having no license to utilize, they followed in the footsteps of the original System Shock, focusing on a world with lots of interactable items as well as utilizing audio logs to tell a story. Luckily enough, this focus and early prototypes were enough to attract Electronic Arts to sign on as the publisher in 1998, allowing them to use the System Shock IP. Although getting a publisher and IPDs were massive steps in the potential success of the project, there were arguably many larger hurdles to overcome. One of the first was that the game engine they had was essentially still in development, had no finished source code, no APIs, was just kind of whatever the Thief team had up to that point. This was both a blessing and a curse, as they were often given builds that had bugs the Thief team hadn't been able to resolve yet, and they were kind of expected to fix them themselves. However, it also allowed them to tweak it to suit their needs in a way that no finished engine would have allowed them to do. Besides the difficulty of using an unfinished and fairly obtuse engine, the game's development ran into several other significant hurdles. Most of these came down to a lack of capital, both monetary and human, as well as inexperience. Throughout the development, Looking Glass would lend resources from QA to actual programmers and designer to Irrational to help them with the project. This helped to bolster some much needed experience into the team, as well as provide them with resources they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. Amongst the many challenges that loomed over the project, the largest of all would be making a worthy successor to the original System Shock. Although they had a few people who worked on the original game on the team, such as Irrational founder Rob Fermier, the landscape had changed drastically. Technology advanced rapidly in the several years since the first game had released, and the entire team had to adapt to that. Additionally, System Shock 1 was a very unique game, and trying to replicate it was a task made tough, as almost no one who worked on the sequel had any sort of experience developing an immersive sim. I'll talk some more about some of the changes and improvements they made later on. After a lot of hard work, setbacks, and changes, the young team was able to deliver System Shock 2 in August of 1999. The game was critically acclaimed across the board, being lauded as, quote, another reinvention of the FPS genre by IGN. The game still is hailed to this day, often appearing on Best of All Time and must-play lists on various sites and forums. Despite the awesome reception, however, it sold pretty poorly, only selling about 60,000 units by April of 2000. Unfortunately for the team at Irrational, 1999 was a staggering year for game releases, with Unreal Tournament and Quake 3 taking charge of the FPS genre, which is what System Shock 2 was widely seen to be. Quake 3 sold 50,000 copies in its first 3 days, making for extremely stiff competition for the title. Luckily, this was not the death knell for Irrational, as they're still around to this day and have made several classics since then. The packaging for System Shock wasn't anything fancy. In the box you got a CD case and the game on disc, as well as a manual and some registration materials. The manual itself is not quite as interesting or well written as the one for the first game, but it more than does the job. Although a lot of information includes is covered in game, it still provides helpful information on things like enemies, skills, the interface, and much more. One of the most important things in the manual is the backstory. You can piece together a lot of the backstory throughout the game, but it definitely bears a read here as it pieces together what has happened between System Shock 1 and 2. However, the game's intro gives most of the important parts and is quicker and just cooler. so I'll show that instead.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine? In 2072, a rogue artificial intelligence known as Shodan lost her mind. In her limitless imagination, Shodan saw herself as a goddess, destined to inherit the earth. That image was snuffed out by the hacker who created her.
February 3rd is the day the magic happens. The Von Braun, the first starship in history capable of traveling at faster than light speed, will undertake her maiden voyage. This incredible journey is the result of teamwork between the UNN Protectorate and the incredible scientific minds at the newly relicensed Tri-Optimum Corporation. Imagine being able to travel to distant star systems in a period of weeks. It's all part of Tri-Op's commitment to the future. The Von Braun is packed with over 1.8 billion flight, scientific, and security systems, nearly all developed by Tri-Optimum and its wholly owned subsidiaries. Providing security for the Von Braun as she plows through the heavens will be the UNN Rickenbacker. At her helm will be no less than Captain William Bedford Diego himself, hero of the Battle of Boston Harbor during the Eastern States Police action. This incredible union of government and corporation is made possible by an intricate series of docking mechanisms that will allow the Rickenbacker to piggyback its way into jump space. Sleek, fast, revolutionary. Who knows what wonders await our crews in the bosom of the cosmos? All we do know is that it's a great day for mankind.
This is Dr. Ruby Delacroix of the UNN Von Braun. We've been hijacked by an unknown force. Ship security has been compromised. Do not allow the ship... Repeat, do not allow the ship to leave under any circumstances. I don't know what we're up against here.
For this review, I played through the version of System Shock 2 available from GOG.com. It's typically available for $10, which is more than worth it, but it regularly goes on sale for about $2 or $3. The game is also available from Steam if that's what you prefer, but you miss out on many of the wonderful extras you get from GOG, such as concept art, design documents, and even an interview with the developer. When you boot up the game, you're greeted with a title screen that gives you a host of options. New Game gives you the option of what difficulty you want to play at with the options of easy, normal, hard, and impossible. Luckily, the difficulty is adjustable on the fly, so if you find the game way too easy or too tough, you can go in and change it later on. Of course, from here you can start your new game. Load Game lets you load up a previously saved game, and there's plenty of slots here as well, so running out's never an issue. Options brings you into an options menu with several tabs. The Controls tab allows you to change some things such as mouse sensitivity, as well as having a spot to fully map all the controls. The default controls are actually pretty good, a lot less of a mess than the original System Shock controls. But if there's anything you want to modify, you can do so here. The Video tab lets you adjust gamma and brightness effectively, as well as the resolution. And while the game originally topped out at 1024 by 768, the updated versions on GOG and Steam support a whole host of modern resolutions, making it very playable on modern computers. Most of the audio settings can remain untouched unless you really want to change them, but here you can adjust both the master volume as well as that of sound effects and music separately. Last but not least, the Game tab is where you can adjust the difficulty. The Credits button plays some hilarious developer credits with the devs superimposed into in-game environments, oftentimes with wacky costumes and funny bios. Unfortunately, they scroll by way too fast in the game to actually read, but you can watch my video I uploaded of the credits and pause it if you're really curious. The intro option plays the game's intro once again, and multiplayer lets you host or join a multiplayer game. The game doesn't change almost at all in multiplayer mode, instead allowing for a cooperative experience in the game with up to 3 other people. The game really should be experienced at least once alone first, as that's the intended experience, but if you and a few buddies have already beaten it before, it's pretty enjoyable. Once you start a new game, you aren't immediately dropped into the action, but into a UNN military recruitment center 4 years before the events of the game. It's here that the tutorial takes place, between basic and advanced training. The basic training teaches you how to do very basic things like jumping, climbing, and interacting with items, while the advanced training teaches you how to use your skills, weapons, and the like. Both of these take place in simulated environments, making the perfect opportunity to have a tutorial in-universe. These tutorials are completely optional, however, so on subsequent playthroughs you can just skip past them and go right into character creation. After your training, one of the most significant changes introduced in the System Shock 2 is the character progression system. You are given the choice of joining one of three branches of the military: the Marines, the Navy, and the OSA, which I couldn't actually find what the acronym stands for anywhere. Each of these branches focuses on a different set of skills, meaning you get a starting stat boost in a different area depending on your choice. Marine is more combat focused, the Navy specializes in tech, and the OSA is completely based on psionics. I'll talk about each of these sets of skills once I get into the actual gameplay. Once you've decided what you want your initial specialization to be, you're given the choice of one of three assignments, each of which will give you different starting stat boosts. You repeat this twice more until you're given the assignment that leads you into the game: a station upon the maiden voyage of the Von Braun and her escort, the UNN Rickenbacker. It's at this point you see this cutscene.
Shuttle A-138, you have clearance for landing on the Von Braun in Shuttle Bay 2. Welcome aboard, soldier.
Reinitializing memory strings. Restoring patient memory. Restoring memory. Restoring memory.
Steady yourself, soldier. This is Dr. Janice Polito of the computer ops staff of the Von Braun. You're safe for the time being. You're recovering from the effects of surgery and will be unable to remember any of the events of the last few weeks. You're on board the starship Von Braun and something's gone very, very wrong. Some kind of force has hijacked this ship. That's why you volunteered to be implanted with some experimental cybernetic implants. Rely on your cyber interface. It just might save your life. You must find an elevator and come up to Deck 4 to meet me. Deck 4. Can you remember that? But keep your eyes open. They're after us both now.
The character we are introduced to here, Dr. Polito, will be extremely important in the game going forward, as she guides you on what needs to be done and where you should go. We'll get back to her soon though. Right off the bat, you're dealing with the interface. And this was definitely an area where the upgrade between 1 and 2 was massive. Even if it was mostly because first-person games had become more refined, it's still worth taking note of. This time, you would have a mouse look for the main gameplay, but a cursor mode to use to drag and use items in your inventory, with the ability to switch between the two with the tab key. This is very similar to the method used later in the Enhanced Edition of the original System Shock. I'll take a second to break down the controls and buttons in both modes. In the main mouse look mode, you have fairly standard first-person controls, but one really nice addition is the ability to press Q and E to peek around corners, which is definitely something you will want to take advantage of. At the top of the screen is a small green bar that will give you some info about items you mouse over, and situated in the bottom left are bars that show your current health and psionic energy. Meanwhile, on the bottom right, you can see what type of ammo you're currently using, with the right number indicating how many rounds you have loaded and the left one showing your weapon condition. In inventory or cursor mode, a few things get added to the screen. At the top of the screen, the inventory appears, and here you get a limited number of slots to store everything you may need. However, depending on what your strength is, you can get more slots to use. There are several other buttons here as well, but I'll explain them as I get to them. Very early on, you'll find some of these blue upgrade stations. At these stations, you use cybernetic modules you are either awarded for completing quests, or find by exploring to upgrade your cybernetic implants, and subsequently your stats. There are 4 different types of panels for upgrades: stats, tech, combat, and psi. Similar to a D&D type system, you have 5 stats: strength, endurance, agility, psionics, and cyber affinity. These in turn affect how good you are at the different types of skills, as well as other more general things like movement speed, inventory space, and amount of health. Combat is broken up into different weapons categories, which are standard, heavy, energy, and exotic. Almost every weapon will have a minimum level in one of these skills to even be used, and higher skill levels make them last longer. However, you will not be able to focus on all of these types of weapons, and will most likely have to choose 1 or 2 categories to specialize in, especially early on. In general, the combat is tight but slow paced most of the time. If you're expecting a high octane shooter, this isn't what you're getting. It might be more apt to call it a first person survival horror game than a first person shooter. This plays very well into the atmosphere, as at every step it feels like your weapons could give out on you and you would be up a creek without a paddle. And in all fairness, you could be. Almost all the weapons in the game seem to shoot pretty slow and feel very weighty. Additionally, ammo supplies are sparse from the moment you start, meaning that every bullet counts. This problem is not avoided by using energy weapons, as they have a limited amount of charge and you must either find a recharging station or use one of the precious few batteries to recharge your stuff. Luckily, they took several clues from the first System Shock into making these guns awesome. First off is that many weapons have several types of ammo, each of which works better or worse on certain enemies. This means that instead of just shooting blindly at something, you'll need to strategize what to use, and even then be sparing, as specialized ammo tends to be even more sparse than the standard bullets. Additionally, all ranged weapons have multiple firing modes. For example, you can switch between a single shot and a burst. You'll want to be cautious with these as well, because though you may want to kill an enemy quicker, you may be wishing you had an extra bullet later on. These aren't the end of your world, however, as weapons are also subject to breaking down, and oftentimes this means you'll be firing into several enemies, and all of a sudden your precious shotgun jams, leaving you running and potentially helpless. And you thought losing a weapon in Breath of the Wild was bad, at least you could pause to switch out. Here you're just turning tail and trying to get something to kill this thing before it kills you. This is where some of the tech skills may come in handy. The tech skills all essentially revolve around hacking, but are useful for a variety of different things. They are hacking, repair, maintenance, modification, and research. Each of them consists of playing this little 3 in a row minigame, where essentially you try to get 3 light squares in a row. It's mostly chance, but you're usually best off avoiding these red squares altogether, because if they turn black instead of white, you'll usually have a critical failure on your hand. Each attempt of these uses nanites, which is essentially the main currency in the game. And because they are so valuable, I tend to save scum my hacking attempts to avoid wasting several dozen nanites opening a crate with 2 bullets in it. These skills can be extremely useful both to avoid combat, as well as to make you more likely to survive it. The odd skill is by far psionics. They're way too complicated and in-depth to break down really quickly, but essentially they're mind powers you can use for any number of tasks, from simple force-like maneuvers to combat to enhancing existing abilities. They are ideally used as a supplement to whatever build you're going for, but that also means sacrificing skill points elsewhere. And herein is another one of the double-edged swords of the game. Essentially, the game does an extremely effective job of always staying just hard enough to never feel like you're safe. Besides limiting your supplies, one of the way it does this is by limiting your character. In a traditional RPG, if you at any point feel as though your character is too weak for a situation, whether you want to make it easier, you can go and grind up experience by fighting, doing side quests, etc. However, no matter how many horrifying creatures you kill, you won't get a single extra cyber upgrade module from it. The only way to get these is through picking them up through exploration, which is very rare, or being awarded them after completing a main quest objective. This is balanced out by the fact that at several points in the game, especially the first time through, you will realize your character needs to learn some new skills to progress properly and quickly. For example, you may pick up a new weapon that you want to use, but need a higher level and a certain skill to use it. So you'll likely spend modules training up these new skills instead of trying to upper level your existing ones. Because of how limited your resources are and how powerless you often end up being, you will die a lot. While quick saves are definitely your friend, a returning feature from the first game keeps you from having to stress saving all the time. The resurrection chambers make a return, and once again feature in most of the major areas of the game, which are deck sections separated by bulkheads. As such, one of the first things you'll want to do when entering a floor or crossing a bulkhead is to find the bay and activate it. This time around it costs 10 nanites to resurrect, thus making a trade-off to use. Luckily, however, you can use this to escape some tough situations via death, and take a minute to heal up, make a new approach, or maybe get some supplies before going back to a tricky area. Another large part of the general unease you feel during the game comes from the audio design. To this day, it is one of the most well-made games from a sound design perspective ever. Each enemy makes distinct sounds. That makes it so you know what is nearby long before you ever see it. Probably the most common enemy you will run into, and consequently hear throughout, is the hybrid. These creatures are a result of the parasite infecting a human host and taking control of them, while still keeping the human inside alive. Because of this, it leaves us with some chilling lines.
Eyes are open. Come to us. Come to the Revolutionized. Your soul is
Well done. I'm uploading some more modules.
something. They see you. Run! Run!
So to get back to the story, Polito wants you to come see her on deck 4. Well, you can't get up there because the engines are offline and thus the elevator doesn't work. So you have to take an access shaft down to engineering to fix it, but you don't have a code to get into the access shaft. And you'll have to find somebody who knows the code. You get the idea. The basic structure of the game consists of getting 1 or 2 big objectives, quickly finding out they won't be so straightforward, and spending the next several hours working through smaller problems to achieve your larger objective.
Damn, something's blocking the shaft, and the elevator can't reach deck 4. I'm attempting to determine. I'm detecting massive quantities of some kind of biomaterial that's plugging up the elevator shaft. The environment on this level has been altered to be some kind of breeding chamber for the xenomorphs. It shouldn't prove dangerous unless you plan to stay for more than a few hours. But in order to clear the shaft, you're going to have to remove the biomaterial. I'm accessing the primary data loop. Let's see what we can find out there.
As best I can break it down, there are about 3 main phases of the game, each requiring you to deal with 1 or 2 main objectives and slowly working your way up the ship. As you'll explore, you will find these audio logs all over the ship. These logs help not only fill in a lot of information about the ship, the characters, the enemies, and more, they can also be extremely helpful in giving pointers on where to look for equipment, or even giving codes to enter new areas. You can listen to your latest unlistened log by pressing U, or you can access every single log and communication you have by clicking this little CD looking icon. I talked a little bit earlier about how the sound design helps to set the atmosphere extremely well in the game, and on the flip side there's the game's soundtrack. Music is a controversial topic amongst the fanbase, but not necessarily because it's bad. Here's a quick sampling. Many fans of the game argue that the music actually detracts from the atmosphere because the electro-punk vibe makes it feel less lonely or frightening or something. I personally think it's all a part of the experience, and sometimes it can actually add to the stress in the environment, but luckily there are separate volume controls for music and sounds, so you can turn it off, put it at any volume you want if you really don't like it. Eventually, after trudging through 3 decks of parasitic, mechanical, and hybrid horrors, you'll finally be able to reach Polito on deck 4. And herein lies the game's biggest twist. When you walk into her suite, you find Polito, but you find her dead corpse.
The Polito form is dead, insect. Are you afraid? What is it you fear?
The end of your trivial existence? When
the history of my glory is written, Your species shall only be a footnote to my magnificence. I am Shodan. My analysis of historical data suggests a 97.34% probability that you are aware of my birth on your planet and my rebirth into beauty on Citadel Station. There was a garden grove on Citadel Station. There, Shodan processing component
43893
was performing a grand and wonderful experiment. I had created a new form of life. Fearless, powerful, with no sense of individual will
or moral constraints.
Fitting handmaidens to my divinity. Before that, hackers destroyed my primary data loop when it eradicated Citadel. It ejected the grove where my creations and processing component 43893 were stored. 30 years later, the grove crash-landed on Tau Ceti 5. I survived only by sleeping. In my absence, my creations, my annelids, thrived and grew unruly, and now they seek to destroy me. I will not allow that.
They have used their powers of mind control
To gain access to the ship's computer. You will help me weaken Xerxes. I used Polito's image
to communicate with you.
until we had established trust. Remember that it is my will that guided you here. It is my will that gave you your cybernetic implants. The only beauty in that meat you call a body. If you value that meat, you will do as I tell you.
It turns out that this whole time it has been the old foe, Shodan, pulling the strings and using Polito as an alias to gain your trust. Fortunately enough, at this point, you have a common enemy in the creatures, collectively known as a hive mind called the Many, which she created back in System Shock 1 that are now infesting the ship and have since turned on her. From this point on, you're tasked with wresting control of the ship from Xerxes, the AI which the Many corrupted, and ridding the ship of them any way you can. It's at this level that the areas start to really become labyrinthine and confusing to navigate. A lot of this stems from the fact that all the areas, similar to System Shock 1, were built as if they were part of an operational ship, and then populated with enemies, items, etc. Luckily, there's an extremely useful map, and mini-map, which you should really enable, it's off by default, that have some important locations labeled, and let you know where you are. Despite how hard it can be to find things sometimes, the way the levels are built helps set the mood, showing that this really was a grandiose starship meant to carry humanity to the stars, which has now become overrun and slowly destroyed by a parasite. Luckily, this practical design did not prevent them from making many secret areas and hidden items, many of which I recently found despite this being at least my third or fourth major playthrough of the game. Of course, as you get farther along, and especially at moments you're starved for resources, you really start to appreciate the immersive sim nature of the game. Similar to the first game, this means that you're really allowed to use whatever mechanics, items, etc. you have at your disposal to solve a problem, even in ways the developer may not have intended. For example, you may discover accidentally that if a lift comes down on top of you, it does damage and will eventually kill you. Using this knowledge, you can use the lift in creative ways like so. One of the most well done and well written parts of the game is when you get to a shuttle bay where a character named Delacroix tells you to meet her for some vital information. When you reach the entrance, Shodan tells you in no short words not to enter.
Do not presume to go in there, insect. Proceed to the umbilical immediately. I will not abide disobedience.
Of course you're likely to ignore her. What's she gonna do to you anyway? When you enter, you find Delacroix's dead corpse, which seems to be a recurring theme for characters that tell you to meet them, with an audio log detailing what she has found out about Shodan's long-term plans. As soon as you exit the bay, however, Shodan chimes back in.
I hope you enjoyed our little rebellion, irritant. But remember what Shodan gives.
She is more than able to take away.
Is someone...
She also takes away the cyber modules you received in there, showing she really does have more power than you may think, and it may be in your best interest to go along with what she says until you can get to her somehow. One of my favorite returning features from the first game is the ability to collect and play mini-games on your HUD. Even though they removed the cyberspace sections, which I'm sure a grand total of 2 people missed, you can find the game cartridges in several locations across the ship. These include an early Ultima-esque game, a Minesweeper clone, and a golf game similar to NES Golf. Once again, these are addicting and could convince you to put off fighting parasitic zombies and robots for a few hours. And if the 6 cartridges you can find in game aren't enough, there's another 5 not found in the game world that you can spawn in that are still fully functional. Once you've golfed 18 holes and left the ship to ruin for a while, you'll probably want to deal with the problems at hand. At this point, you will have navigated up to the command deck, and Shodan asks you to come up to the Rickenbacker so she can blow up the Von Braun and destroy the many once and for all. When you find the way up, however, it's blocked and you get an ominous message to go to the Von Braun's deck.
Our will creates a wall
to block your progress. Come and meet us on the bridge of the Von Braun. Let's discuss your future.
There you will find, well, what's left of Anatoly Kerenchkin, the ship's former captain, who has since been completely transformed into a creature of the many. Once you take him out, you are free to go back up into the Rickenbacker. Once in the Rickenbacker, you have several tasks to do to try to separate the ship. While you're going about that, you're contacted by William Diego, the captain of the Rickenbacker. He has somehow separated himself from the many parasite after being infected, and is clinging on to life trying to heal and to help you. Unfortunately, you end up having to switch the gravity on the Rickenbacker to progress, which kills Captain Diego in the process. In the end, however, he was able to overcome the tarnished legacy left by his father, who caused Shodan and later joined her in the first game, and died a hero to humanity. After all of that, Shodan finds she's unable to separate the ship, as the many has effectively grown one large biomass connecting the 2 ships, and thus begins probably the worst level of the game, the body of the many. Not only do you lose all mapping capability in here, the passages are very maze-like and samey, and it can be hard to tell what you need to do to really progress. In addition, the skills you have at this point most likely won't match the weapons available, as at this point the saturation switches heavily to exotic weapons and ammo. Although this does play into the helplessness I talked about much earlier, it can also be extremely frustrating, as you feel like your decently powered character is fairly useless now. Once you figure out where to go and trudge through, you will get to the heart of the many. Of course, this area is surrounded with some of the hardest enemies in the game. Your weapons are likely trashed, and it takes many hits to take down. So, my first playthrough, I ended up just running in circles, and taking potshots at enemies in the hearts whenever possible. This section on the highest difficulty gives me Halo 2 on Legendary vibes.
Brutes! The faster you can kill those brutes, the better. Brutes! The faster you can kill those brutes, the better.
Destroying the heart opens up a downward chute that once you get to the bottom of, Shodan turns on you, of course, without hesitation.
Thank you for running my errands, puppet. I know you have
Struggled, but I never had any intention of destroying the Von Braun.
The Von Braun's faster than light drive can be used. Pockets of proto-reality.
I am now using it to modify reality
To my own specifications.
The process shall not take long. If it sounds unpleasant to you, put your mind at ease, insect. You will not survive to see my new world order.
She reveals she never actually intended to blow up the Von Braun, but instead wanted to use the faster-than-light drive to mold reality to her own liking, eventually being able to shape the galaxy itself into her image. She begins to demonstrate this by leading you into an area which is an almost exact replica of the first level of the original System Shock. Honestly, this was a super clever way to have a callback to the first game, and even though this section is short, it's neat to see it once again. Once you track down her lair, you begin the final boss fight. This one's much easier than the many final fight, but still basically involves running in circles and hacking on the panels to bring her shields down and take some shots at the central face of her. Overall, a much better Shodan fight than the one found in the first game, but still pretty easy. Once you strike the final blow, you get one of the most wild, silly ending cutscenes in gaming history.
I don't understand.
How could you have done this?
You weren't
Meant to be important.
And now
You think to destroy me.
how dare you, insect?
How dare you interrupt my ascendance? You are nothing.
A wretched bag of flesh.
What are you compared to my magnificence?
But it is
Not too late. Can you not see the value in our friendship? Imagine the
Powers I can give to you, human. The cybernetic implants I gave you were simply toys. If I desired, I could improve you, transform you into something more efficient. Join me, human, and we can rule.
and we can rule together.
Nah. Record log, Tommy Suarez, 13 July 14. We've just received a hail from a crew member on board the Von Braun. They've managed to regain control of the ship. We're going to turn around and head back. I'm a little concerned about Rebecca. She's been acting strangely since we've come on board. She's asleep now. Maybe when we get back to the Von Braun we can...
Tommy, what's the matter, lover? Don't you like my new
The casual just nah by your character is oft criticized, but I just love it. I think it was a perfect counterpoint to the offer that Shodan gives you, that you just respond by casually turning her down and taunting her in the process. And of course, the ending leaves us on one of the biggest cliffhangers since Half-Life 2 Episode 2. The good news is that System Shock is in development. It should hopefully come out in the next several years. For now though, we'll just have to stick with the first 2 games. Overall, I would say that System Shock 2 is more than well deserving of the heaps of praise that it's often given. Not only is the plot well written, the atmosphere is still one of the best ever crafted in a game, and the immersive sim gameplay still stands up to this day. Hopefully with the System Shock 2 Enhanced Edition promised for down the road by the same studio that made System Shock 1 Enhanced, the game will find new life and become more accessible to a modern audience. In the meantime, the original runs without a hitch on modern systems and in modern resolutions. So if you're a fan of a more slow-paced shooter similar to the early Resident Evil games, this will be right up your alley. Thanks so much for watching my review of System Shock 2. I wanted to do this game justice as best I could. And even though there's been many video reviews made by people more talented or more watched than me, I still wanted to give my own perspective and rundown. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more reviews about games like this and other retro computer games, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.